The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky surface of Kepler 442b, as Commander Vexthal folded his leathery wings against his back and stared at the cave entrance with growing frustration. 3 cycles had passed since his survey team had arrived on this distant world, and they were no closer to mapping the underground system than when they first landed. The crystalline formations that lined every surface of the cave created a maze of interference that scrambled their most advanced equipment. Vexthal was proud of his species' achievements in sonic mapping. The Zephyrians had evolved from creatures much like the bats of distant Earth, though they had long since surpassed their primitive ancestors through centuries of genetic enhancement and technological advancement. Their natural echolocation abilities had been refined to near perfection, allowing them to navigate the deepest reaches of space using nothing but sound waves reflected off distant objects. They had mapped the turbulent atmospheres of gas giants and threaded their way through dense asteroid fields where visual navigation would have been impossible. Yet here, on this unremarkable planet, a simple cave system had defeated them completely. Cave mouth yawned before them like a hungry beast, its interior disappearing into absolute darkness after just a few meters. The walls were covered in strange crystalline growths that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, creating beautiful but useless patterns that their instruments could not penetrate. Every sound that entered the cave came back distorted and meaningless, as if the very rocks were laughing at their attempts to understand what lay within. Lieutenant Keshtar approached with the latest readings from their portable sonic mapping array, her large ears drooping with disappointment. The device in her clawed hands beeped softly as she adjusted its settings for the 100th time that morning. Like all Zephyrians, she possessed hearing far superior to most species in the known galaxy, capable of detecting the faintest whisper of sound across vast distances. Her enhanced auditory organs could process thousands of acoustic signals simultaneously, building detailed 3-dimensional maps of any environment within seconds. "The interference is getting worse, Commander," she reported, her voice carrying the musical quality common to their species. "The deeper we try to probe, the more scrambled the returns become. It's as if the crystalline formations are deliberately designed to confuse our equipment." Vexthal clicked his tongue in annoyance, a sound that would have been inaudible to most species, but rang clearly in the enhanced hearing of his team. "Impossible. These are natural formations, not some alien defense system. There must be a solution we haven't considered." 3 other members of his survey team had gathered around the cave entrance, each carrying sophisticated instruments that represented the pinnacle of Zephyrian acoustic technology. Their portable echolocation enhancers could map underground river systems from the surface, and their harmonic analyzers could distinguish between different types of rock formations based on the subtle variations in how they reflected sound waves. On any normal world, these tools would have produced detailed maps of the entire cave system within hours. But this was not a normal world. The planet designated Kepler 442b had been selected for joint exploration between the Zephyrian Commonwealth and several other species as part of an ongoing scientific cooperation initiative. The world showed signs of valuable mineral deposits, and the extensive cave systems suggested the possibility of underground water sources that could support future colonization efforts. What should have been a routine survey mission had turned into an exercise in frustration and failure. Sergeant Quinder emerged from the cave entrance, his specialized sonar equipment hanging uselessly from his shoulders. His face bore the expression of defeat that had become all too familiar over the past 3 cycles. "Commander, I've tried every frequency range our equipment can produce. The cave system extends far beyond what we initially estimated, but the acoustic returns become completely unintelligible after the first 100 meters. We're detecting what might be multiple levels, possibly connecting to other cave systems, but we can't be certain of anything." The news was not what Vexthal wanted to hear. His mission parameters required a complete geological survey of the area, including detailed mapping of all underground formations. Without this information, the scientific value of their expedition would be severely limited, and the other species participating in the joint exploration would question the Zephyrians' vaunted reputation for acoustic mapping. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new sound reached his enhanced hearing from the direction of the landing field. The distinctive hum of different engine technology announced the arrival of another vessel, and Vexthal turned to see a human ship settling onto the rocky ground with mechanical precision. The vessel was smaller than the Zephyrian craft, but appeared sturdy and well-maintained, bearing the insignia of the Human Research Initiative. Humans were relative newcomers to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only a few centuries ago. Most species regarded them with a mixture of curiosity and gentle condescension, recognizing their intelligence and determination while noting their obvious biological limitations. They lacked the enhanced senses that most spacefaring species had developed through either evolution or technological augmentation, relying instead on crude external instruments to navigate and explore their environment. The human ship's airlock cycled open with a soft hiss, and 5 figures emerged wearing the practical clothing typical of their species. Vexthal had worked with humans before on other joint missions and found them pleasant enough companions, though their tendency to attempt tasks far beyond their apparent capabilities could be both amusing and occasionally irritating. The leader of the human group approached with the confident stride that seemed characteristic of their species, regardless of the situation they faced. He was a tall specimen with graying hair and the weathered appearance of someone who had spent considerable time on different worlds. His companions followed at a respectful distance, carrying equipment that looked primitive compared to Zephyrian technology but had proven surprisingly effective in previous encounters. "Commander Vexthal," the human said, extending his hand in the greeting gesture common to his species. "I'm Captain Jake Morrison from the research vessel New Horizon. We received word that you were having some difficulties with the cave mapping project." Vexthal accepted the handshake, still amazed by how humans insisted on physical contact as a form of communication. "Captain Morrison, welcome to Kepler 442b. I'm afraid our difficulties are more significant than we initially reported. The cave system appears to be far more extensive than our preliminary survey suggested, and the mineral formations are creating interference patterns that our equipment cannot penetrate." One of the human females stepped forward, her attention focused on the cave entrance with obvious interest. She was younger than the captain, with dark hair pulled back in a practical manner and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings. "I'm Dr. Lisa Carter, xenogeology specialist. We've encountered similar problems with crystalline interference on other worlds. Sometimes the standard approaches don't work, and you need to try something completely different." Vexthal appreciated the humans' diplomatic phrasing, though he doubted their primitive methods could succeed where Zephyrian technology had failed. Still, cooperation was the foundation of the Joint Exploration Initiative, and he had no desire to appear unwelcoming to their new colleagues. "We would welcome any suggestions you might have, Dr. Carter," he replied politely, "though I should warn you that this cave system has proven unusually challenging, even by our standards." Dr. Lisa Carter walked slowly around the cave entrance, her eyes studying the crystalline formations that covered every visible surface. The strange mineral growths caught the light from Kepler 442b's sun and threw it back in rainbow patterns that danced across the rocky ground. She reached out to touch one of the larger crystals, feeling its smooth surface under her fingertips, while Captain Morrison and the other humans spread out to examine different aspects of the cave mouth. Commander Vexthal watched the humans with growing impatience as they conducted what appeared to be a very primitive inspection of the area. His team had already studied extensively. The Zephyrians possessed instruments that could analyze the molecular composition of the crystals from a distance. Yet these humans insisted on physically touching and examining everything with their crude senses. It seemed like a waste of time when more pressing matters demanded attention. "Dr. Carter," Vexthal said, his voice carrying a slight edge of frustration, "we have already conducted thorough geological surveys of the cave entrance and the surrounding area. Our instruments have identified the crystalline formations as a complex silicate structure with metallic inclusions that create acoustic interference patterns. The problem lies not in understanding the crystals themselves, but in penetrating the interference they generate throughout the cave system." Lisa nodded thoughtfully, still running her hands along the crystal surfaces. "I understand your findings, Commander, but sometimes looking at a problem from a different angle can reveal new solutions. These formations are beautiful, and they're clearly affecting sound waves in ways that your equipment wasn't designed to handle." Lieutenant Keshtar stepped forward, her large ears twitching with what Vexthal recognized as barely controlled irritation. Like many Zephyrians, she took great pride in their species' acoustic abilities and felt insulted when other species suggested their methods might be inadequate. "Dr. Carter, with respect, your species lacks the biological adaptations necessary for effective sonic navigation. Our hearing is enhanced far beyond anything humans possess, and our equipment amplifies those abilities even further. If we cannot penetrate this cave system, it is highly unlikely that your primitive methods will succeed." The other humans had gathered around Lisa, and Vexthal noticed that one of them was a young male who had been studying the cave entrance with particular intensity. He was smaller than Captain Morrison, with dark hair and the kind of focused expression that suggested deep concentration. Unlike the others, he had not been examining the crystals or taking readings with human instruments. Instead, he seemed to be listening to something that only he could hear. "This is Danny Rodriguez," Captain Morrison said, following Vexthal's gaze. "He's our cave specialist, trained in underground exploration and mapping. Danny has worked in some of the most challenging cave systems on Earth and several other worlds." Danny looked up from his intense study of the cave mouth and smiled politely at the Zephyrian commander. "Commander Vexthal, I've been listening to the acoustic properties of this cave entrance, and I think I might understand why your equipment is having trouble. The crystalline formations aren't just creating random interference. They're actually creating a very complex, but predictable pattern of sound reflection and absorption." Vexthal's membrane-covered eyes narrowed slightly. The idea that a human could understand acoustic properties better than a Zephyrian was almost insulting, but diplomatic protocol required him to listen politely. "Please explain your theory, Mr. Rodriguez." Danny gestured toward the cave entrance, his expression growing more animated as he spoke. "Your equipment is designed to work with normal rock and mineral formations, right? But these crystals are doing something different. They're not just reflecting sound waves back in straight lines. They're bending and focusing the waves in ways that create false echoes and phantom spaces. Your instruments are probably picking up reflections from the same surfaces multiple times, making the cave appear much more complex than it actually is." The explanation was interesting, but Vexthal remained skeptical. Even if that were true, how would you propose to overcome this interference? "Our instruments represent centuries of technological development, specifically designed for acoustic mapping in challenging environments." Lisa spoke up before Danny could answer. "We'd like to try a different approach entirely. Instead of fighting against the crystalline interference, we want to work with it. Danny here has experience with natural echolocation techniques that don't rely on sophisticated equipment." The silence that followed was filled with the subtle chittering sounds that Zephyrians made when they were extremely surprised or confused. Sergeant Quinder was the first to find his voice, speaking in the rapid, high-pitched tones that indicated disbelief. "Natural echolocation. You mean without any technological enhancement whatsoever? That's exactly what we mean, Danny said calmly. Humans have been exploring caves for thousands of years, using nothing but basic tools and our natural senses. We developed techniques for understanding underground spaces long before we had any sophisticated equipment. Vexthul felt his pride as a Zephyrian commander stirring into something approaching anger. The suggestion that primitive human techniques could succeed where advanced Zephyrian technology had failed was not just insulting, it was completely absurd. His species had evolved specifically for acoustic navigation, spending millions of years developing the biological and technological tools necessary for sonic mapping. The idea that soft, nearly deaf humans could accomplish what they could not was laughable. Mr. Rodriguez, Vexthul said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an unmistakable tone of challenge. Are you seriously suggesting that your primitive auditory organs and crude human techniques could map a cave system that has defeated our most advanced sonic equipment? Danny nodded without any sign of being intimidated by the alien commander's obvious displeasure. I'd like to try, yes. Sometimes the simplest approaches work best, especially when the environment is interfering with more complex methods. Other Zephyrians had gathered around their commander, their body language clearly indicating they shared his skepticism and growing irritation. Lieutenant Keshtar's ears were flattened against her skull in the way that suggested she considered the human's proposal to be somewhere between foolish and offensive. This is impossible, she said, her musical voice carrying sharp notes of disbelief. The cave extends for kilometers in multiple directions. Our preliminary surveys detected vertical shafts that drop hundreds of meters, underwater sections that could drown any surface-dwelling creature, and passages so narrow that only a single being could pass through at a time. Even if you could somehow navigate the first few chambers, you would quickly become lost in a maze that has no logical pattern. Captain Morrison stepped forward, recognizing that the situation was becoming tense. We understand the risks, Commander, and we're not asking you to accept responsibility for our safety. Danny has volunteered to attempt the mapping as a demonstration of human cave exploration techniques. If he fails, we'll simply try a different approach. Vexthul looked at the small human who stood calmly beside his captain, showing no sign of fear or doubt despite the obvious dangers of the cave system. The Zephyrian commander found himself caught between his duty to maintain diplomatic relations with the humans and his species' wounded pride at the suggestion that their methods were inadequate. Very well, Vexthul said finally, his voice carrying the formal tones of an official challenge. If you wish to demonstrate human cave exploration techniques, we will not prevent you. However, I must insist on certain conditions for your safety and for the scientific validity of the attempt. Danny looked interested rather than concerned. What conditions did you have in mind, Commander? First, you will wear a blindfold to ensure that you are not relying on visual navigation, since that would make the comparison with our acoustic methods invalid. Second, you will carry no technological equipment beyond basic safety gear. Third, we will monitor your progress and intervene if you appear to be in immediate danger. The young human considered these conditions for a moment, then nodded his agreement. Those terms seem fair, Commander. When would you like me to begin? The morning air on Kepler 442b carried a slight chill as Danny Rodriguez stood at the cave entrance, adjusting the simple cloth blindfold that Dr. Carter had tied securely around his eyes. The fabric blocked out all light completely, leaving him in absolute darkness, even though the alien sun was shining brightly overhead. In his right hand, he held a small geological hammer that felt familiar and comfortable after years of cave exploration. A coil of strong rope hung from his belt, along with a few basic safety items that the Zephyrians had insisted he carry. Commander Vexthul activated his chronometer with a soft, clicking sound the device beginning to record the exact time that the human experiment would begin. The Zephyrian commander's expression showed barely concealed amusement, mixed with professional curiosity about how quickly this demonstration of human limitations would end. Around him, his team members had positioned themselves with their enhanced hearing focused on the cave entrance, ready to track every sound that Danny would make during his doomed attempt. "You may begin whenever you're ready, Mr. Rodriguez," Vexthil announced formally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected to witness an interesting, but ultimately futile display of primitive techniques. Danny took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the clean air of the alien world before stepping forward into the cave mouth. The temperature dropped noticeably as he crossed from sunlight into shadow, and the quality of sound around him changed immediately. The open echoes of the planet's surface gave way to the more confined acoustics of enclosed space, and Danny smiled slightly as he recognized the familiar sensation of entering an underground environment. He raised his geological hammer and struck it gently against the crystalline wall beside the cave entrance. The sound that came back was unlike anything he had heard before, but it carried information that his trained ears could interpret. The crystals created complex harmonics that most people would find confusing, but Danny had learned long ago to listen for the patterns hidden within seemingly chaotic acoustic feedback. Daff, dash, tap, dash, tap went his hammer against the wall, creating a steady rhythm that echoed through the cave chambers ahead. Danny paused, listening carefully to how the sound traveled and returned, building a mental picture of the space around him. The crystalline formations were indeed creating interference, but they were doing so in predictable ways that followed the natural laws of physics. Outside the cave, Lieutenant Kesh-Tar tilted her large ears forward to catch every nuance of the sounds coming from within. Her enhanced hearing could detect the human's heartbeat, his breathing, and even the soft scraping of his feet against the rocky floor. She could also hear his hammer strikes with perfect clarity, but the acoustic information they provided seemed meaningless to her sophisticated understanding of echolocation principles. "What is he doing?" she whispered to Sergeant Quinder, who was monitoring the sounds with equal confusion. "Those hammer strikes are completely random. There's no systematic pattern that could provide useful navigation data." Danny moved deeper into the cave, his hammer continuing its steady percussion against the walls and floor. To the listening Zephyrians, his movement seemed confident despite the obvious impossibility of navigating effectively with such crude methods. They could track his progress through the first chamber and into what their instruments had identified as a complex junction where multiple passages branched off in different directions. The young human paused at the junction, and his hammer strikes became more frequent as he tested the acoustic properties of each possible path. The Zephyrians expected him to become confused and disoriented at this point, since their own sophisticated equipment had been unable to determine which passages led deeper into the cave system and which were dead ends. Instead, Danny chose the leftmost passage without hesitation and continued moving at the same steady pace he had maintained since entering the cave. His hammer created an almost musical rhythm as it struck different surfaces, sometimes ringing against crystalline formations and sometimes producing the duller sound of impact against regular stone. Dr. Carter stood with Captain Morrison near the cave entrance, listening to the sounds of Danny's progress with professional interest. Unlike the Zephyrians, she understood what her colleague was doing and why his methods might succeed where more sophisticated approaches had failed. The aliens' enhanced hearing and technological instruments were designed to process vast amounts of acoustic data simultaneously, but sometimes that very sophistication could become a disadvantage when dealing with unusual conditions. "He's mapping the reflection patterns," she explained quietly to Captain Morrison, though she kept her voice low enough that the Zephyrians could not easily overhear. "The crystals aren't creating random interference. They're focusing and redirecting sound waves in ways that follow mathematical principles. Danny learned to work with similar formations in the Carlsbad Caverns back on Earth. Deep within the cave system, Danny had encountered his first real challenge in the form of a vertical shaft that dropped away to darkness below his feet. His hammer strikes revealed that the passage continued downward for a considerable distance, but he could also detect the sound signatures that indicated a narrow ledge running along one wall of the shaft. The Zephyrians, listening from outside, heard the change in his hammer strikes as he began working his way carefully down the vertical section. Their enhanced hearing could track his progress with perfect accuracy, but they could not understand how he was navigating safely through terrain that their instruments had warned them was extremely dangerous. Commander Vexthul found himself genuinely puzzled by what he was hearing. The human's movement through the cave showed none of the hesitation or backtracking that would be expected from someone who is lost or confused. Instead, Danny seemed to be following a definite route through the underground maze, as if he could somehow see where he was going, despite the blindfold and the absolute darkness of the cave interior. 20 minutes had passed since Danny entered the cave, and his hammer strikes were becoming fainter as he moved deeper into the system. The Zephyrians could still track his location through their enhanced hearing, but the acoustic signatures were growing more complex as he navigated through areas that their equipment had been unable to map effectively. "This is impossible, Sergeant," Quinder muttered, his ears twitching with nervous energy. He should have become lost by now. The passages in that section branch and reconnect in ways that would confuse even our most experienced navigators. Lieutenant Keshtar was equally bewildered by the human's apparent success. Perhaps he memorized our preliminary survey data and is simply following the routes we identified before the interference became too severe. But even as she spoke, Keshtar knew that explanation could not be correct. The Zephyrian surveys had only penetrated a few hundred meters into the cave system before the crystalline interference made further progress impossible. Danny had already been underground for longer than it would take to traverse all of the areas they had successfully mapped. Inside the cave, Danny had discovered something that the Zephyrian instruments had missed entirely. The crystalline formations were not randomly distributed throughout the cave system. Instead, they followed patterns that were related to the geological structure of the underground chambers. By understanding how the crystals affected sound reflection, he could use them as navigation aids rather than obstacles. His hammer struck a particularly large crystal formation, and the resulting harmonics told him that he was approaching a vast, open chamber that extended both upward and outward beyond the range of his simple acoustic methods. The Zephyrian surveys had detected hints of this chamber, but had been unable to determine its size or configuration. Due to the interference patterns. Danny smiled in the darkness as he realized that he was beginning to understand the true scope of the cave system. The underground chambers were connected in ways that the alien instruments could not detect, forming a network that was far more extensive than anyone had suspected. The crystalline formations that had defeated the Zephyrian technology were actually markers that could guide an experienced cave explorer through the entire system. His hammer continued its steady rhythm as he moved through chambers that no intelligent being had ever seen, mapping passages that existed in perfect darkness, but were as clear to his trained senses as if they were illuminated by bright lights. The Zephyrians outside continued to listen in growing amazement as the impossible human demonstration continued far longer than anyone had expected. The sound of footsteps on rocky ground came from an entirely unexpected direction, causing Commander Vexthul to spin around in confusion as he tried to locate the source. His enhanced hearing had been focused on the cave entrance where Danny Rodriguez had disappeared 23 minutes earlier, but now human footsteps were approaching from behind the Zephyrian position. The commander's large ears swiveled frantically as he attempted to understand. How this could be possible, Danny emerged from a second cave opening that was located nearly 2 kilometers from where he had entered the underground system. His blindfold still securely in place, and his geological hammer hanging casually from his right hand. He moved with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where they were and where they had been, showing no signs of the disorientation or exhaustion that would be expected after navigating through an unmapped cave system in complete darkness. Zephyrian stood in stunned silence as the young human reached up and untied his blindfold, blinking slightly as his eyes adjusted to the bright sunlight of Kepler 442b. His clothes were dusty from his underground journey, and there were small scratches on his hands from contact with rough stone surfaces, but otherwise he appeared completely unharmed by his expedition through terrain that had defeated their most sophisticated equipment. Fascinating acoustic properties in there, Danny commented with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather rather than an impossible feat of navigation. The crystalline formations actually help once you understand how they affect sound. Reflection patterns. They create a kind of natural guideline system that runs throughout the entire cave network. Dr. Lisa Carter approached with a tablet computer in her hands, and Danny accepted the device with a smile of satisfaction. His fingers moved quickly across the screen as he began sketching out a detailed map of the cave system, drawing passages and chambers with the precision of someone who had studied every meter of the underground terrain. The map showed connections between different levels, marked dangerous areas where the ceiling appeared unstable, and identified 3 separate underground water sources that could support future exploration teams. Lieutenant Keshtar moved closer to examine the human's work, her large eyes widening with disbelief as she recognized features that matched the fragmentary data their instruments had collected before the interference became too severe. But Danny's map extended far beyond anything the Zephyrian surveys had detected, showing a complex network of chambers and passages that stretched for kilometers in multiple directions. "This cannot be accurate," she said, her musical voice carrying notes of desperate denial. "You were underground for less than half an hour, and you claim to have mapped an area that our preliminary survey suggested would take days to explore properly." Danny looked up from the tablet with an expression of mild surprise, as if he had not expected his accomplishment to seem particularly remarkable. 23 minutes is actually pretty good time for a cave system of this size. The acoustic signatures were clearer than I expected, once I figured out how the crystals were affecting the sound patterns. Commander Vexthil approached the human with slow, careful steps. His membrane-covered eyes focused on the detailed map that showed areas of the cave system that his team had not even suspected existed. The young human had marked vertical shafts that dropped hundreds of meters, underwater passages that connected distant chambers, and narrow crawlways that provided shortcuts between major sections of the underground network. "How did you navigate without echolocation organs?" Vexthil asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. "Your species lacks the biological adaptations necessary for sonic mapping. You have no enhanced hearing, no specialized organs for processing acoustic data, no technological augmentation of your natural senses." Danny shrugged with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted the abilities of his own species. "We don't need biological adaptations for this kind of work. Human brains are incredibly good at processing audio information and building spatial maps from sound patterns. We've been doing it for thousands of years in various forms." Captain Morrison stepped forward to support his team member, pride evident in his expression as he watched the Zephyrians struggle to accept what they had witnessed. Cave explorers on Earth have been mapping underground systems for centuries, using techniques very similar to what Danny just demonstrated. Blind individuals in our society routinely navigate complex environments using nothing but sound and spatial reasoning. Sergeant Quinder had been studying the map with growing amazement. comparing Danny's sketch to the fragmentary data that Zephyrian instruments had collected over 3 days of intensive effort. The humans' work showed details that their sophisticated equipment had missed entirely, including several large chambers that appeared to contain significant mineral deposits. Your primitive methods succeeded where our advanced technology failed, he admitted reluctantly, his ears drooping with the shame of professional defeat. But how is this possible when our equipment represents centuries of technological development specifically designed for acoustic mapping? Danny finished adding the final details to his map and handed the tablet back to Dr. Carter before addressing the confused aliens with patient explanation. Your equipment is designed to work with normal rock and mineral formations, but these crystals are doing something different. Instead of fighting against the interference they create, I used it as a navigation tool. The concept was so alien to Zephyrian, thinking that Lieutenant Keshtar tilted her head in the gesture that indicated complete confusion. You used the interference as a navigation tool. How is such a thing possible? The crystalline formations aren't creating random noise, Danny explained, gesturing toward the cave entrances that dotted the rocky landscape around them. They're focusing and redirecting sound waves in very specific patterns that follow the geological structure of the cave system. Once you learn to read those patterns, they tell you exactly where you are and where the passages lead. Commander, Vexthul found himself facing a reality that challenged everything he had believed about his species. Superiority in acoustic navigation. The Zephyrians had evolved specifically for sonic mapping, spending millions of years developing the biological tools necessary for echolocation. Their technology amplified those natural abilities to incredible levels, allowing them to map environments that would be impossible for most species to navigate. Yet this primitive human had accomplished in minutes what they had failed to do in days, using nothing but a simple hammer and the crude auditory organs that his species had inherited from their evolutionary ancestors. The implications were staggering and deeply troubling to the Zephyrian commander's sense of professional pride. I don't understand how your brain could process acoustic information more effectively than our enhanced organs, Vexthul said, his voice carrying the frustration of someone whose fundamental assumptions about the universe had been challenged. Our hearing is demonstrably superior to yours in every measurable way. Danny considered the question seriously, recognizing that his answer might help bridge the gap between human and Zephyrian understanding. Your hearing is definitely better than ours in terms of sensitivity and range, but sometimes having too much information can be a disadvantage. Your enhanced senses were picking up thousands of acoustic signals simultaneously, but that made it harder to focus on the specific patterns that mattered for navigation. Dr. Carter nodded in agreement with her colleague's analysis. Human auditory processing evolved to filter out irrelevant information and focus on the sounds that were most important for survival. In this case, that filtering ability allowed Danny to ignore the random interference and concentrate on the meaningful acoustic patterns created by the crystalline formations. The explanation made sense from a theoretical standpoint, but Commander, Vexthul still struggled to accept that primitive human methods could be superior to advanced Zephyrian technology. His entire worldview was built around the assumption that technological sophistication and biological enhancement represented clear improvements over natural abilities. Annie had already begun preparing for a second expedition, checking his equipment with the methodical care of an experienced explorer. The cave system connects to at least 3 other networks that I detected during my survey, he said, addressing the group of amazed aliens and proud humans. If you'd like, I can map those as well. Should take about an hour for all of them combined. The casual confidence with which the young human offered to accomplish in 1 hour what the Zephyrian team had failed to do in 3 days left Commander Vexthul speechless with a mixture of admiration and wounded pride. The implications of what they had witnessed settled over the Zephyrian team like a heavy blanket as they stood in the alien sunlight, watching Danny Rodriguez prepare for his promised exploration of the connected cave systems. Commander Vexthul felt something that he had never experienced before in his long career of interstellar exploration: the humbling realization that his species' most advanced capabilities had been surpassed by methods so primitive they seemed almost insulting. 3. Cycles of intensive effort using the finest acoustic mapping equipment in the known galaxy had produced nothing but frustration and failure. Their sophisticated instruments, designed by the greatest minds of Zephyrian civilization and enhanced by centuries of technological advancement, had been defeated by crystalline formations that this young human had turned into navigation aids. Using nothing but a simple hammer and his species' crude auditory organs, Lieutenant Keshtar approached the human team with the careful steps of someone who was still struggling to accept an impossible reality. Her large ears were tilted forward in the gesture that indicated intense concentration as she tried to understand how everything she had believed about acoustic navigation could be so fundamentally wrong. Your primitive methods succeeded where our advanced technology failed, she said, her musical voice carrying notes of bewilderment and grudging respect. But how is this possible when our biological adaptations and technological enhancements represent millions of years of evolutionary development specifically designed for sonic mapping? Captain Morrison stepped forward to answer the lieutenant's question, recognizing that this moment represented an important opportunity for building understanding between their species. His expression showed both pride in his team members' accomplishment and sympathy for the alien's wounded professional pride. Sometimes the simplest approach is the most effective, he explained gently. Danny didn't fight against the crystalline interference because he didn't see it as an obstacle to be overcome. Instead, he recognized it as information to be interpreted and used. Dr. Lisa Carter added her own perspective to the captain's explanation, her scientific training helping her articulate the principles behind Danny's success. Human adaptability has always been our strength in dealing with challenging environments. We don't rely on single specialized solutions because we've learned that every situation is different and may require a completely new approach. Danny had finished checking his equipment and was ready to begin his exploration of the additional cave systems that his initial survey had detected. But before entering the caves again, he turned to address the confused Zephyrians with the patient tone of someone who genuinely wanted to help them understand what had happened. "Your technology is incredible," he said, gesturing toward the sophisticated instruments that lay scattered around the cave entrance like expensive toys that had failed to work properly. But it was designed to work with normal geological conditions. And this place isn't normal. The crystals aren't just creating interference patterns. They're actually organizing and focusing sound waves in ways that can guide you through the cave system if you know how to listen. Sergeant Quinder tilted his head in the gesture that indicated he was trying to process information that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the universe worked. But our enhanced hearing should allow us to detect those patterns more easily than your primitive auditory organs. We can process thousands of acoustic signals simultaneously and build detailed three-dimensional maps from the slightest sound variations. The human cave specialist nodded in acknowledgement of the sergeant's point, but his expression suggested that the Zephyrian was missing something important about the nature of the problem they had been trying to solve. "That's exactly the issue," Danny explained with genuine sympathy for their confusion. "Your enhanced senses were picking up so much information that it became impossible to focus on the specific patterns that mattered for navigation. The crystalline formations were creating thousands of different acoustic signals, but only a few of them were actually useful for mapping the cave system." Dr. Carter expanded on her colleague's explanation, drawing on her scientific background to help the aliens understand why their superior capabilities had actually become a disadvantage in this particular situation. Human auditory processing evolved to filter out irrelevant information and concentrate on the sounds that were most important for survival. In an environment like this cave system, that filtering ability becomes more valuable than raw sensitivity or processing power. Commander Vexthul found himself confronting a disturbing truth about the limitations of technological advancement and biological enhancement. The Zephyrian approach to problem-solving had always been based on the assumption that more sophisticated tools and superior capabilities would inevitably produce better results. The idea that primitive methods could sometimes be more effective than advanced technology was profoundly unsettling to everything he believed about progress and civilization. "You're saying that our evolutionary advantages actually worked against us in this situation," he said slowly, his voice carrying the careful tones of someone who was trying to understand a concept that challenged his most basic assumptions about how the universe operated. Danny smiled with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his species' ability to find solutions to difficult problems. Evolution doesn't always produce the best possible solution to every problem. It produces solutions that work well enough for the environments where a species developed. Your echolocation abilities are perfect for the kinds of challenges your ancestors faced, but these crystal caves are unlike anything that existed in your evolutionary environment. The young human turned toward the nearest cave entrance, ready to continue his demonstration of primitive human techniques that had proven superior to advanced alien technology. "The cave system connects to at least 3 other networks that I detected during my first survey. Each connection represents a different type of geological formation with its own acoustic properties. If you'd like to understand how human cave mapping works, you're welcome to listen while I explore them." Lieutenant Keshtar looked at Commander Vexthul with an expression that clearly requested permission to continue observing this impossible demonstration. The idea of learning navigation techniques from a species they had considered primitive was humbling, but the evidence of human effectiveness was too compelling to ignore. "We would be honored to observe your methods, Mr. Rodriguez," Commander Vexthul said formally, though his voice carried undertones of wounded pride mixed with genuine curiosity about how these humans had achieved what his team could not. Danny nodded his appreciation for the alien commander's willingness to learn from their supposed inferiors. "The most important thing to remember is that every cave system is different and requires its own approach. What worked here might not work anywhere else, but the basic principles of listening carefully and adapting to local conditions apply everywhere." As the human cave specialist disappeared into the second cave entrance with his simple hammer and coil of rope, the Zephyrians found themselves confronting a fundamental shift in their understanding of intelligence, technology, and the nature of problem-solving itself. The primitive species they had dismissed as crude and limited had demonstrated capabilities that their own advanced civilization could not match. Commander Vexthul made a mental note that would eventually become part of his official report to Zephyrian Command, the recommendation that all future exploration missions should include human consultants, not because of their technological capabilities, but because of their remarkable ability to find unconventional solutions to problems. That defeated more sophisticated approaches. The sound of Danny's hammer echoed from within the second cave system, beginning another impossible demonstration of human adaptability that would further challenge everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about the relationship between advancement and effectiveness in dealing with the unexpected challenges of an infinite universe.